Hi, my name's Sable, and I was told not to come back home unless I returned $100,000 I never stole. At first, I thought it was a cruel joke, but when I looked around the dinner table, my father glaring, my sister silent, and my mother refusing to meet my eyes, I realized they weren't joking at all. They said I took everything. But what if they were the ones who planned it all along? What if the people who raised you rewrote you out of the family without saying a word? Would you walk away or fight for the truth? Let me show you what happened next. I hadn't been back in almost a year, but I knew the route to my parents' house like muscle memory. The turns came automatically, even as my thoughts didn't. The sun was just dipping behind the ridge when I pulled up to the driveway. October in Bozeman always carried that strange kind of chill, the kind that didn't bite right away, just crept in quiet until it settled deep in your bones. I stepped out, holding a wrapped package, a cookbook Mom had mentioned once in passing. I found it online 3 months ago, signed by the author. It felt like something she'd smile at, something only a daughter who still paid attention would know to buy. Inside, the smell of rosemary and butter filled the air. Tamsin was the first to notice me. She beamed too wide, the way people do when they're trying too hard to pretend. "There she is," she said, coming toward me with outstretched arms. Her hug was brief, perfunctory. Colby gave a stiff nod from the kitchen counter. I looked for Mom. She was in the dining room, setting out silverware, her back turned. Dad stood near the fireplace, glass in hand, not looking at me. His expression didn't change when I said hello. Just the kind of man who thought indifference was punishment enough. I placed the gift on the buffet, next to a bouquet someone else had brought, and took off my coat. Everything looked the same, but the air wasn't right. We sat down. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, all the classics, arranged like they always had been. The kind of meal that told you this family still knew how to perform tradition. And then, just as Dad lifted his wine glass, before anyone had even touched their plates, he slammed it down. The sound cut clean through the room. "Return the $100,000, he said, voice sharp, "or don't come back again." The words didn't register at first. Not really. It was like hearing someone speak underwater. I looked around, expecting someone to laugh, or flinch, or tell me it was a joke. But no one moved. Tamsin was staring at her plate like it held the answer. Colby blinked once, then kept his eyes on his napkin. And Mom. Mom still didn't look up. My fingers tensed against the fabric of my jeans. "Excuse me?" I asked, though I'd heard every syllable. Dad leaned back, as if repeating himself was a favor. "The $100,000, the money you helped organize for your mother's account. It's missing, and you're the only one who had access." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My chest tightened, not from guilt, but from the sheer absurdity of it. That money wasn't theirs to accuse me over. I'd wired it almost a year ago, from a year-end bonus that barely dented my savings. There was no fanfare, no contract, no promise of repayment. Just trust. Apparently, that trust didn't go both ways. "You really believe I took it?" No one answered. And that silence, God, that silence, said more than anything else could. I wasn't being questioned. I was being sentenced. They didn't ask if I needed help. They didn't ask if I was okay. They just assumed that because I knew how to move money, I must have moved it for myself. The pie I brought sat untouched on the counter. Pumpkin, her favorite, made from scratch the night before, using her old recipe with the extra nutmeg she always swore made the difference. I didn't even get the chance to pull off the foil. I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped against the hardwood, the only sound in the room. "I'm going to step out," I said quietly. Nobody stopped me. I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door, didn't bother with the gift still on the table. I walked out to the car, the night colder than I remembered. Frost was already climbing the windshield edges. I didn't go home. I didn't have the energy to fight the storm I knew was building. Instead, I pulled into a motel off the highway. The kind I'd passed a dozen times and never thought I'd actually enter. The lobby smelled like microwaved coffee and pine-scented cleaning spray. The clerk didn't ask why I needed a room. I was grateful for that. The room itself was small. 2 lamps, 1 crooked painting, a desk with no chair. I didn't take off my coat, just sat on the edge of the bed, hands clenched, heart pounding, not with rage, but with something worse. Clarity. They hadn't asked me if I did it. They'd already decided I had. That was the part I couldn't get past. Not the accusation, not even the humiliation, but the absence of the question. I had built a career untangling fraud cases more complex than anything this family would ever encounter. I'd spent years protecting companies from internal theft, learning every trick in the book. Now, I'd been framed by people who barely understood how online banking worked. But I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a meltdown. I would find the truth. Not because I needed them to believe me, but because I no longer cared if they did. No one followed me out the door, no headlights in the rear view, no calls. Just the rhythm of tires on asphalt and the dull ache of knowing when something ends, without a single word saying so. I didn't sleep much. The motel walls were too thin, and the ceiling fan clicked like it was counting down something I hadn't named yet. I kept my boots on. Somehow, that made me feel less exposed. By morning, frost had crept up the edges of the car windows. I drove back to the house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed one thing before I walked away for good. Answers. When I stepped into the kitchen, it was quiet. My mother was standing at the sink, drying the same plate in slow, hypnotic circles. The kind of motion you make when you're trying not to think. The smell of toast lingered in the air, but no one had touched it. She didn't turn around when she heard me. Just said, "Coffee's fresh," as if I'd come in from work, not from exile. I poured myself a cup, sat down at the table. The chair creaked beneath me. I let the silence sit a moment, heavy like fog that won't lift. Then I asked carefully, "Do you think I took it?" She paused, just long enough to confirm the weight of the question, but never looked up. Her voice came out softer than I expected. "Let's not do this now." I stared at her, long enough that I hoped it burned, but she never met my eyes. I left the cup untouched, walked out without saying another word. That hurt more than the accusation, because it wasn't her calling me a thief. It was her refusal to defend me that did the damage, the kind of betrayal that doesn't make a sound. By late morning, we were at the neighbor's house, Linda's place, 2 doors down. She throws a brunch every year the day after my mother's birthday. Deviled eggs, strong mimosas, and polite lies layered over quiche. I sat near the end of the table, next to a vase of wilting daisies. The seat no one had claimed. People talked around me, about their dogs, their knee surgeries, their travel plans to places they'd probably cancel last minute. I sipped orange juice and said nothing. Then Nida Murrow, my mother's cousin, or maybe a childhood friend, I never kept it straight, sat beside me with a cheerful smile and asked, "So how do you know Tamsin? Work friends?" I turned to look at her. She wasn't joking. "I'm her sister," I said flatly. Nida blinked, real surprise spreading across her face. "Oh, I'm sorry. You just didn't come up." Didn't come up. I nodded slowly, as if that made sense. As if it wasn't a gut punch disguised in casual politeness. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just a family fight. It was erasure. A quiet, careful rewriting of the narrative. One where I'd already been cut out. The rest of the brunch blurred together after that. I don't remember who said what. I just remember how easy it seemed for them to exclude me, without malice, without effort. Back at the motel, I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees like I was waiting for something. But nothing came. Not a call, not a message, not even a cheap apology text with a heart emoji slapped on the end. I took out a yellow legal pad from my bag. The same one I'd used for client notes in Manhattan, now repurposed for something far less elegant. I wrote down the date I helped Mom set up her online banking. September 8th. Under it, I wrote, who had access? Devices used? Withdrawals? Locations? Then I underlined, only 3 people had the password. Me, Tamsin, Mom. And Mom wouldn't know how to log in without a cheat sheet taped to the fridge. It wasn't about clearing my name, not anymore. It was about knowing how far they were willing to go to disappear me, and why. The yellow pad sat beside me, open to a page I couldn't stop staring at. Every time I looked at the words, only 3 people had the password, my hands went still. My eyes burned, not from tears, but from exhaustion I didn't realize I was carrying. There was no comfort in the quiet of that motel room, only clarity, sharp, unforgiving. I leaned over and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, the wallpaper still a photo of my niece from years ago, before things turned. Before I started being edited out of the narrative, the first place I checked was the login history on Mom's banking app. I still had access, not to transact, but to view. When I helped her set it up, we agreed I'd be her backstop if anything ever locked her out. I told her it was standard procedure, that it was about security. Now that same access was the only thing standing between me and complete ruin. September 8th. Setup day. That much checked out. September 11th. First withdrawal, $20,000. I hadn't even unpacked my suitcase in Chicago when that transaction went through. It hadn't come from Mom's phone. I traced the device ID. It was registered to an iPad, one I knew she rarely used unless Tamsin reminded her. The IP address matched the house Wi-Fi. I ran through the app activity again. Each withdrawal happened 5 days apart, each just under the threshold for mandatory bank reporting. This wasn't someone panicking. It was someone methodical. This wasn't a mistake, I whispered aloud. This was built. I clicked into my old texts with Mom. No alerts, no mentions, nothing about feeling unsure or needing help logging in. Because she hadn't done any of it, but someone else had. I moved to the next tab and searched my emails. I was looking for the evite to her birthday brunch. I remembered the subject line being oddly formatted. There it was, sent from Tamsin's Gmail account. I clicked on it. My name in the recipient line said, Sabalori Ellery. That extra L wasn't an autocorrect error. It was deliberate. People misspell your name when they haven't used it in a while, or when they'd rather not remember it clearly. But Tamsin? We grew up in the same house. She knew how to spell my name better than most. I pulled up a copy of the invite she sent to our cousin Whitney. That one had her own name spelled flawlessly, with an emoji at the end even. No mention of me in the message body. No, looking forward to seeing you all. Not even a generic, Sable will be there too. I wasn't forgotten. I was left out. It was a subtle thing, a digital slip, but I'd seen it too many times in corporate fraud cases to ignore. Little inconsistencies that build a case, tiny cracks that let the truth shine through. I sat back and picked up my pen again. This time, I drew a line down the center of the page and started a timeline. Sept 8. Account setup, Sept 9. Mom's outpatient scan. Tamsin stayed overnight. Had access to her phone and documents. Sept 11. Withdrawal 1. Sept 16. Withdrawal Mar2. Sept 21. Withdrawal so 3. Each withdrawal was under $25,000. Each perfectly timed to avoid detection. 3 transactions. 3 5-day gaps. 3 neat cuts from a lifetime of savings. I circled the September 16th transaction. That was the one that didn't make sense. According to the metadata, it came from a second device. Not Mom's iPad, not her phone, not the desktop she barely touched. This IP was tied to another user profile, one that had been previously flagged in my company's internal security training. I double-checked the IP address. I froze. It matched Colby's internet provider. And not just the provider, his exact modem signature, one we'd flagged once before in a different case. The coincidence was too convenient to ignore. You got sloppy, I muttered. And that was the first real crack in the mirror they'd built around me. I knew Tamsin had motive, resentment, proximity, a long history of needing to win invisible competitions I never entered. But Colby? He was supposed to be the voice of reason, the chill one, the guy who always shrugged things off and poured another drink. Now he was a data point on my timeline. I stood up from the bed, stretching my spine after hours hunched in quiet fury. The cheap ceiling fan spun overhead, still clicking out its private rhythm. I pinned the printout to the motel's corkboard, right under the timeline. Each piece was falling into place, each lie lining up like checkboxes. They thought they'd built a perfect setup, one no one would question, because it came from the inside. But they underestimated what it meant to grow up always needing to prove you belonged. They forgot I made a career out of spotting the things other people miss. And now I had names. I had dates. I had devices. And I had a signature that wasn't hers. I didn't sleep much. Not out of restlessness. My mind was too sharp for that now. I'd moved from disbelief to clarity, and there's no going back once you start connecting dots that were never meant to be found. Around 8 a.m., I took a drive toward downtown Bozeman. The roads were quiet. That late autumn stillness clung to everything. The yellowing trees, the tired storefronts, the bank. Greenwell Mutual wasn't a flashy branch, no marble floors or smiling greeters, just a row of tellers behind plexiglass and the familiar humming buzz of fluorescent lighting. I didn't walk in. Instead, I parked down the street and opened my laptop. A former colleague from my old firm had quietly sent me access to security polls. Nothing illegal, just footage our firm had rights to analyze during internal banking investigations. It had taken one text and no explanation. That's how much credibility still carried weight in the world I actually belonged to. I loaded the files. The first video played in choppy black and white. A woman entered the branch wearing a gray hoodie, sunglasses too big for her face, and a cloth mask. She moved quickly, shoulders slightly hunched, glancing once over her shoulder. Not enough to draw suspicion, just enough to clock her surroundings. She approached the counter and fidgeted. Her right hand tapped out a rhythm on the counter. I'd seen that motion before. For years. Every time she lied, Tamsin tapped her fingers, like she was playing piano no one else could hear. The woman lowered her mask briefly to confirm her ID with the teller. It was her. She didn't even bother changing her voice. Just leaned forward and said something, probably confirming her mother's name. There was no effort to fully disguise herself, because why would there be? No one was supposed to check. I paused the frame and took a screenshot. Her profile was visible enough. I could identify the earrings, Mom's vintage pair with the broken clasp Tamsin had borrowed years ago and never gave back. I played the second clip. Same hoodie, different day. This time the withdrawal was larger. She moved with more confidence, as if the first time had proven how easy it would be. I leaned back in the motel chair. The video still played on loop. Her hand, her voice, her carelessness. Back at the motel that afternoon, I reviewed the login history again. I cross-referenced it with the bank's access logs and the footage timestamps. That's when something shifted. The first login after setup hadn't come from Mom's phone. It had come from a device linked to the home Wi-Fi, a generic tablet. But its unique identifier matched a product Colby had registered for a rewards rebate last summer. The MAC address was a perfect match. I pulled the metadata again. The IP was traced back to the Kittredge home, of course. But the recovery email? Not Mom's, and not mine. It was Colby's personal email, the one he used for junk mail, discount codes, and the fantasy football league he obsessed over every fall. The phone number attached for two-factor authentication? Not Vera's, and certainly not mine. It was a burner line Colby once used for property listings, rerouted through a VoIP service. Technically legal. Ethically? Another story. They didn't need to be tech geniuses, I muttered, staring at the screen. They just needed me to trust them. They'd used the opportunity I handed them. The day I walked Mom through the process, answering her questions, setting up her password. I even told her, "We'll keep it simple, just in case you ever need help." I should have known better. I'd spent my entire career tracing fraud that started with good intentions and ended with betrayal. I'd seen this pattern before. Only this time, it wore my sister's perfume and signed my father's name. I printed the login log, highlighted the suspicious entries, circled the IP address. I added it all to a growing pile, each document its own piece of evidence, its own betrayal. The sun dipped behind the hills as I taped still frames to the motel wall. Like a detective's board, each line pointed to the next. Transaction dates, devices used, physical visits to the bank, login times, amounts. Each time, they got bolder. Each time, I got more certain. I reached for the folder I'd labeled Receipts Phase 1. Inside, I slid the screenshots, the metadata printouts, the signature comparisons. Then I picked up a Sharpie and wrote 2 names side by side at the top of a blank sheet. Tamsin. Colby. Below that, I wrote 1 sentence in block letters. Time to find out how much Mom actually knows. Because the signature on that authorization form, the one giving full access, was shaky, like it had been traced, or signed under pressure, or forged. It didn't look like the way Vera signed birthday cards or grocery checks. There was something off in the slant of the letters, something uncertain, like it had been done while someone else watched. And if I was right, this wasn't just financial fraud. This was manipulation, of trust, of power, of love. And it started with the person I used to call my sister. The next afternoon, the house was louder than usual. Tamsin's voice carried from the living room, over-explaining how to set up the new smart TV, while Vera smiled and nodded as if any of it mattered. A neighbor I barely recognized stood nearby, holding a mug of spiced cider, nodding along with Tamsin like she was narrating a home makeover show. I stayed by the stairs, invisible but listening. The TV sat in its box, the packaging half peeled, styrofoam scattered across the rug. "Oh, Tamsin," the neighbor said with a chuckle. "This must have cost you a fortune. You really are so generous with your parents." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. That was the same model I had ordered 2 weeks ago, charged to my card, shipped straight to this address, gift note included. I'd even added a bow. Tamsin didn't hesitate. She looked up, caught my eye from across the room, and smiled just enough. "You're welcome," she said. Vera didn't correct her. The neighbor didn't blink. No one turned to ask me anything. I walked away. Not out of weakness, but because the lies were no longer shocking. They were expected. Later that evening, I offered to help bring coats in from the garage after most of the guests had left. It was cold out, and I figured keeping my hands busy would buy me a few moments of silence before dinner. As I gathered the last of the jackets from the back of the hall bench, something slipped out of the inside lining of Vera's rust-colored coat. I crouched and picked it up, a folded receipt, creased like it had been tucked there for weeks. I flattened it against my palm. $15,000 withdrawal. Greenwell Mutual Bank, October 15th, 11:47 a.m. But Vera had been at choir rehearsal that morning. I'd driven her there myself. She insisted I drop her off so she wouldn't be late. I remembered the time, the weather, the fact that she wore the same coat. I stared at the slip of paper for a long time before folding it again and sliding it into my pocket. The coat didn't go back on the hook. I hung it in the back closet. That night, I found Tamsin alone in the kitchen. The house had quieted, just the hum of the dishwasher and the occasional floorboard settling under our father's pacing above us. She was rinsing a mug when I walked in. I didn't sit. I leaned on the counter, far enough that she couldn't dismiss me, close enough that she had to register I was still here. "If you're going to steal," I said, "at least be original. You already took credit for the TV. But that receipt? Sloppy work." She froze for half a beat, then resumed scrubbing the mug like it had personally wronged her. "You've been snooping," she muttered. I didn't respond. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands, and gave me that tight little grin she always wore when she felt cornered, but wouldn't admit it. Are you threatening me now? No, not yet. I folded my arms. But I'm not stupid. And I'm not alone. I've started documenting everything. She laughed once, but it didn't reach her eyes. You're really going to tear this family apart over a misunderstanding? A misunderstanding? I echoed. You used our mother's trust. You helped empty her account. And then you let everyone think I did it. Tamsin picked up the mug again, wiping the same spot twice. You always act like you're so righteous, Sable. You think just because you moved out and got fancy degrees and a job in some tall building, you're better than the rest of us. I never said that, I replied calmly. But I did expect that if I offered help, I wouldn't be turned into the villain behind my back. She narrowed her eyes. People believe what makes them comfortable. You being the bad guy? That's easier for them. I took a breath. Well, they'll have to get uncomfortable. She stepped closer then, just one step, and dropped her voice. You've always been good with paperwork, but this isn't court. This is family. We don't play by your rules here. That's funny, I said, because last time I checked, stealing is illegal everywhere. She rolled her eyes and turned away, but I could feel it. Under the surface, she was rattled. I left the room, walking with purpose. I wasn't bluffing. The folder I'd built was no longer just research. It was evidence. And I wasn't going to wait for them to give me a seat at the table again. They already pushed me out. I was making my own. As I passed the hallway, Vera stepped out of the dining room, carrying an empty tray. She glanced at me, opened her mouth to speak, but stopped. I nodded once, short and final. She didn't stop me. The next morning, I drove back to the motel and made copies of every receipt, every timestamp, every form. By the time I hit print on the last document, my folder had doubled in thickness. I labeled it Phase 2. The next time they tried to rewrite history, they'd find my handwriting all over it. After I left the print shop, I didn't go straight back to the motel. Something in me tugged toward the house. Not out of sentiment, but unfinished business. I knew I wouldn't have long. Vera was still prepping for another small dinner with church friends, and the dining room would be her domain for at least an hour. That gave me just enough time. I parked half a block down, entered through the side gate, and stepped in through the laundry room. Quiet. I moved through the hallway and slipped into Vera's home office, if you could call it that. It was really just a former guest bedroom where bills and mail went to die. The room smelled like paper and faint lilac. A stack of unopened bank statements sat on a rickety bookshelf, neatly ignored. I headed straight for the filing cabinet. Middle drawer. I didn't have to think twice. Inside was a labeled folder. Legal, medical. I pulled it out and flipped through. Insurance papers, prescription plans, old appointment summaries. And then, finally, what I was looking for. A durable power of attorney form, signed by Vera 2 years ago, when she had outpatient surgery. I remembered that signature. I was there when she signed it, right-handed, with her reading glasses halfway down her nose, grumbling that the font was too small. Her pen had left a small ink blot on the M in her last name. Natural, fluid, flawed. Then I found the new authorization form, dated 6 weeks ago, granting online banking access to Tamsin. The penmanship was close. Too close. Each letter looked practiced, not written. They'd traced it. They'd used the old form as a guide. But a traced signature never breathes the same way a real one does. And someone who'd never seen Vera sign under stress wouldn't know her tell. She always rushed the tail of her R's when nervous. The forged version didn't. I snapped photos of both documents and returned everything exactly as I found it. On my way out, I passed the hallway gallery wall. Vera had asked me, earlier that morning, if I could help straighten a few of the frames before her guests arrived. I figured that was her way of softening. Or distracting. The top row held the usual suspects: wedding portraits, family reunions, a few blurry cruise photos. But one frame caught my eye. New. Slightly shinier. The photo inside was recent. Orlan, Vera, Tamsin, Colby, and their girls, all dressed in fall colors, standing in front of the fireplace, smiling like they belonged on a holiday postcard. I wasn't in it. I didn't need to ask when it was taken. I already knew. Last Thanksgiving, the one I skipped for a client arbitration in Seattle. I'd texted, I'd sent a pie, I'd even called during dessert, and somehow I'd been erased. They'd assembled their own perfect version of a family, trimmed down, tightened, easier to manage. I took the frame off the wall, dusted it with my sleeve. Then I rehung it, lower, where it almost touched the floor. Let them trip over it. Later that night, back at the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed with my knees drawn up. The folder now had its final puzzle piece, the forged signature. It fit like a key in a lock that had waited too long to be turned. I laid everything out on the table, taped the evidence to the wall in sequence. Still from the bank video. Tamsin, login record, Colby's IP, authorization form, traced, transaction flow, from Vera's account to a third-party fund tied to Colby. I added one more photo of the new family portrait. Not because it was evidence, but because it was motive. They hadn't just taken money, they'd tried to write me out of existence. I scanned every page, every receipt, every timestamp, compiled it into a secure folder on my encrypted drive, then emailed it to the family attorney. Subject line, formal evidence submission, confidential. I stared at the send button for a second, then clicked it without hesitation. My screen went dark. The hum of the motel's mini-fridge was the only sound. They wanted to smear my name, rebuild a family without me, and dress it up like a misunderstanding. I wasn't playing that role anymore. Let them find out what it feels like when the quiet one stops staying quiet. By the time I zipped up the tote bag with the binders inside, the motel clock had crept past 10:30 p.m. I'd done everything I could, laid out the trail, the dates, the faces, the numbers. Everything they thought they buried, I'd unearthed. The next step was simple. Show up. But first, I needed to tie up one last loose end. The next morning, I drove to the Greenwell Mutual branch on 5th. Not the main location downtown, but the smaller one, quieter, easier to navigate without drawing attention. I walked in with my old credentials in hand, using the professional courtesy still associated with my former firm. The woman behind the glass, Kendra, was newer, maybe late 20s. She recognized the name on the letterhead, but not my face. That worked in my favor. I'm working with a family attorney on a private matter involving a pattern of withdrawals. I'd like to request digital access logs and surveillance timestamps for 3 transactions. She tapped on her keyboard, then frowned. "These are flagged," she said. "Flagged how?" "Just restricted access. System locked. That doesn't usually happen unless a manager places a hold or someone requests redaction." "Redaction?" I kept my voice even. "Why would a surveillance clip on a standard transaction be redacted?" She hesitated, glancing toward the office door behind her. "It's listed as overwritten. That's odd." I didn't flinch, just pulled out a sticky note, wrote the exact timestamps from my records, and slid it to her. "Do me a favor. Pull the metadata logs. I don't need footage. Just proof that footage once existed. And when it went missing." Kendra nodded slowly, lips pressed into a line. I thanked her and left before any questions could surface. I wasn't going to risk interference, not this close to the end. Back at the motel that night, I lined up 3 printed transaction logs on the desk. Same withdrawal amounts, same pattern, same delay between them. Each deposit ended up in an account registered to Orlin Kittredge. At first glance, it looked like my father was simply consolidating household assets, but the account activity told another story. Every dollar was being rerouted. Each transfer, exactly 1 day later, went straight to a portfolio fund, under Colby Vexler's name. They used my father's clean credit to hide the movement. It wasn't genius, it was lazy, but it worked. because they knew no one would dare accuse Orlin of anything, and even fewer people would question Colby, the nice guy who always fetched the wine, who always had Vera laughing over dumb real estate stories. They needed a clean name to open the door, I murmured, circling the final transfer on the printout. But they couldn't resist moving the money where they thought I wouldn't look. I reached for a red marker and drew a thick, deliberate circle around the transaction log. Then I stacked it into the growing exhibit pile. There was no doubt now. This wasn't just carelessness, this was collusion. And it was going to stop. The following day, I assembled 2 binders on the small desk tucked into the motel's corner. One labeled family copy, the other legal copy, certified. I flipped through each one, page by page. Tamsin's surveillance still at the teller window, Colby's IP address from the login record, the forged signature, the deposit trail from Mom's account to Orlin's, the forwarding to Colby's fund. I added the missing surveillance metadata with a note that read, "Footage exists, now overwritten." There were no monologues, no imagined courtroom speeches in my head, just silence, focused, measured, cold. I zipped the tote shut and set it gently on the floor beside the chair. The motel light flickered once, then steadied. Then I said it out loud. Not to anyone in particular, just to myself. Let's see if they still call me family after this. I didn't mean it to sound tough. I meant it the way someone says, "It's going to rain," after watching the clouds all afternoon. It wasn't a threat. It was just what came next. Late afternoon light stretched across the road as I turned onto the block. I didn't pull into the driveway. I parked at the curb, engine ticking after I shut it off. The tote bag sat on the passenger seat, heavy with more than paper. The house looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. I stepped out slowly, adjusted the strap of the bag on my shoulder, and walked up the path. Not like a guest, not like a daughter, but like someone who had been summoned to finish something. Inside, the air was warm. Rosemary and something buttery drifted from the kitchen. The familiar hum of Vera's dinner rituals echoed down the hallway, dishes clinking, oven timer beeping. But the sound didn't soften anything. Tamsin was sitting on the kitchen counter, ankles crossed, drinking from a stemless glass. She didn't smile. Colby leaned against the fridge, arms folded. He nodded at me without a word. Vera was arranging salad on a serving platter. Orlan stood at the stove, stirring a pot of soup like he was auditioning for calm. No one greeted me. I walked past them, straight to the island, and set the tote down with care. Then I unzipped it. I took out the first binder, family copy, flipped it open without looking up. "Let's walk through it together," I said, voice level. "Since none of you asked." The room went still. First, I laid out a still image from the security footage. Tamsin, wearing a hoodie, speaking to the teller. I slid it forward. She didn't move. Next, the login logs, Colby's IP address, metadata, timestamps. Then the forged authorization, side by side with the real signature from 2 years ago. The differences circled. Finally, the transaction trail, funds withdrawn from Vera's account, deposited into an account under Orlin's name, then rerouted to Colby's investment portfolio. I didn't rush. I wanted every second of silence to stretch like a held breath. Orlan broke first. "What is this?" I met his eyes. "This is the money you accused me of stealing, walking itself, step by step, into your son-in-law's hands." Vera blinked. Slowly. Her hand paused over the salad tongs. Tamsin's face remained blank, but her fingers tightened around the glass. Colby cleared his throat. "She's twisting this. These things don't always tell the full story." I held up the last page, tapped it. "This is a certified audit trail, already submitted to your attorney, 2 weeks ago." Orlan took a step back. I turned to Tamsin. "You used Mom's condition. You waited for me to leave. Then you covered your tracks with a smile and let everyone else point at me." Her voice was low, brittle. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," I said. "You did that when you chose to erase me." Colby opened his mouth again, but Vera's voice cut through. We didn't know what to believe. I turned to her. You didn't want to believe me. That's different. It was easier to assume I was the problem. That way you didn't have to ask what was really happening under your roof. Tamsin dropped the glass into the sink harder than necessary. You always think you're above everyone, that your job, your career, your apartment. I never said I was better, I interrupted. I said I was family, and I expected the same in return. She looked at me like I'd slapped her, but I didn't flinch. I slid the binder closed, tucked it back into the tote, and slung the strap over my shoulder. You told me not to come back unless I returned the money, I said, turning toward the door. I paused once. I didn't take the money. A beat. But I brought the truth. No one stopped me, not this time. The door clicked shut behind me, just a soft sound, barely more than a whisper. No footsteps trailed after me. No one called my name. Not even the porch light came on. I walked down the same front steps I'd climbed 100 times before, except now, every inch of that sidewalk felt like a clean break. Not an escape, not a punishment, just a release. The air was cool, and I could smell the dampness of the earth under the lawn. Somewhere down the block, someone was grilling. The scent of meat and mesquite drifted faintly through the twilight. It was the kind of detail I used to associate with home. Now, it only reminded me I was finally stepping out of a house that had closed the door on me long before I returned. I paused halfway to the curb, glanced back once. Not for sentiment, not for second thoughts, just confirmation. They hadn't locked me out. They'd let me in just long enough to show me who they'd rather I wasn't. Back in Chicago, 2 weeks later, the rhythm of the city folded around me like a worn sweater. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt still. The envelope came on a Thursday. No fanfare, just tucked among bills and circulars. My name typed cleanly in the return address window. Inside were 2 things. The first, a letter. Handwritten. The ink slightly smudged in places, like it had been started and restarted. The handwriting was unmistakably Vera's. It wasn't long. Just a folded photo of me, Tamsin, and David from when we were kids, dressed in mismatched Halloween costumes, me as a scarecrow with crooked makeup. On the back, a single sentence. We didn't know how much we'd miss you until you were gone. There was no apology, no explanation, just that. The second was from the attorney's office, dry, procedural, a confirmation that Tamsin and Colby had been removed as agents of power of attorney. Vera had signed a new form in front of a notary. Sable Ellery no longer needed to prove anything. The paper did that now. I folded the letter twice and slipped it into my filing cabinet. Not because I planned to use it again, but because it deserved to exist somewhere. I didn't reply to either message. Closure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just choosing not to respond. That Saturday, I unlocked the doors to the community center 2 blocks from my apartment. The first session of a free weekend seminar I'd offered, Financial Self-Defense for Seniors, was about to start. 15 people showed up, more than I expected. I walked them through common fraud schemes, how to detect manipulation, what documents to never sign alone. No one asked me what made me qualified to teach this. Toward the end, during the Q&A, an older woman in the back raised her hand. Wispy hair, wide cardigan, soft eyes. I wish I had a daughter like you, she said. I smiled. Not politely, not reflexively, but with a fullness I hadn't felt in years. Not because I needed to hear it, but because I finally believed someone meant it. I closed up the center by 5 p.m., stacked the chairs, locked the supply cabinet, and shut off the lights. The sun was lowering outside, brushing the brick buildings in that familiar copper glow. I walked home in silence. No podcasts, no phone calls. Just me. You don't always get to go home, I thought, gripping the tote bag slung over my shoulder. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you build something better than the place that let you go. And if I ever walk back into that house again, It won't be to be accepted. It'll be to be seen. Before I go, I want to leave you with this. What happened to me wasn't just about money. It was about trust. How fragile it is. How easily it can be manipulated by the people closest to us. But here's what I learned. You don't need everyone to believe you to be right. And you don't have to keep bleeding just to keep a seat at a table where you're not respected. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. I didn't set out to win. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth. And I got it. Not for them, but for me. So, if you're watching this and you've ever been pushed aside, falsely blamed, or made to feel like your voice didn't matter, please know, your silence isn't weakness. And when you're ready, your truth will be louder than anything they tried to erase. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever had to walk away from your own family to find peace? Or maybe you were the one who stayed silent, like Vera. Or stood by, like Orlan. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Or just type 1 if this story hit home for you. And if you didn't connect with the video, that's okay too. Tell me why. Let's keep the conversation honest. Let's keep it human. If this story touched you, helped you see something more clearly, or simply made you feel less alone, please hit subscribe. We've got more real stories coming your way. Stories about resilience, justice, and those quiet victories we don't always see. Thank you for spending time with me. I'll see you in the next one.